Hey everybody, OperationZ here, and this is the story of Abraham, part 5. And we're going to continue on through where we left off, and we're here in Genesis 14:1. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Ariak, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations. And then here's Genesis 14:2, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zor. So Bela was what they called it, but Zor is what the Jews called it, is all that means when it says which is Zor. Zor or Zoar, however you would pronounce this in the right, correct way. But they made war with them, and we can't really be sure, but there are they're descendants from either Shem or Ham, more than likely, but they all spread out throughout the world. So it's kind of going to backtrack for a minute. So I just want to do that here because it ties in with the Genesis. But right here I wanted to make mention that all these people, like all the people in the world at this time, and now also, they're descendants of Noah, of either his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, or Japheth. And all of these people here, they could be either Shem or Ham. It could even be Japheth too. But basically, I wanted to make mention that the world does divide, and it's said to backtrack further in the genealogies. In Peleg's day, it talks about, that's one of the descendants of one of the sons. In Peleg's day, like where the earth was one solid mass known as Pangea, the whole world ends up dividing, and it talks about that in Peleg's day back in one of the earlier chapters of Genesis. And we no longer have Pangea, but we spread out into having the different continents. And it's said that basically all these people that are there in the different areas, that's how pretty much everything divides up in different ways. And then the people that were on those areas when it divided stayed there. Like we're said to be, or the indigenous people that were here, they were actually descendants of Japheth. So I know that. But continuing on though, because I was just wanting to get into basically how all these people at this time, that they're all descendants from Noah and one of the 3 sons of Noah. All these people, all these kings that are battling and fighting at that time, that's where I was getting at with that. And it's backtracking a little bit, but I just wanted to go on ahead and explain that, and explain, that it does talk about the world even dividing and whatnot. It doesn't call it Pangea here. That's something that we call it as Pangea, before the earth divided. But basically, all these people here are making war with each other, and Abram's caught smack dab in the middle of it, because this happens next. Genesis 14:11, and they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals and went their way. So this happens, all these kings that come against Sodom and Gomorrah and those other kings that were in alliance with each other. The other ones, when Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and all the other ones, they looted them and took all their goods, which was a common practice in wars in those times. And looting was typical behavior after a battle or a war would take place, that there'd always be looting, and they'd loot the bodies of anything that they'd find on the bodies of their enemies, and they would loot anything that they had that was of any value. They would just take it and make it their own. And that was something that they always did, the people did in those days. And so Genesis 14:12, and they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. So they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, which is his nephew, dwelt in Sodom, who dwelt in Sodom, his goods, and departed. So they took Lot and his family and everything that they had and left and went their way. And we're going to see what happens next. As I was saying before, that Abram is very courageous and faithful in God, and we see that with what happens next. Genesis 14:13, and there was one that was escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. So these that are here are people that dwelt in the land with Abram, and they're confederate with him. That with what happens next, so it's told what happens next, but these people also go with him. And I can't remember right now which people that they were exactly, because it doesn't make mention of it right now. But they had, they were confederate with them, which means they had an alliance and agreement of peace because they dwelt in the land together. And 14:14, and when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants born in his house, 318, and pursued them to Dan. So we see the great courage of Abram. Like, Abram was not necessarily a trained fighting man of war. He was just as a regular man. And, he was just as a normal person, not a man of war. And, we see that he takes his trained men, only 318 men. Now keep in mind, these are many people that he fights against. It's actually many battles that he goes through, several just to do what he does next, which I can't go too far ahead. I'm trying to stay right where I'm at here. And basically, he takes them up. When Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them to Dan. So yeah, when the Hebrews and many people of that time, when they say brother, it basically means, of the same, it means basically that they are, that they're all, like when they would say it later on, that they're all as the Hebrews, or, in this case, it's his kin, so they say brother, even though it's his nephew. And that's just the way that they said things and did things. But we see that he takes his trained men, 318, and pursues them to Dan. Now, another interesting thing too, it's actually not Dan at this point, but when Moses writes the book of Genesis, he refers to them as what they are, to be when they're wrote, because it would be read later on. Like, actually, this is what God gives Moses to put down and write, which is a very fascinating thing, because when Moses writes this, they weren't even in, because Moses dies before they get to the promised land and before it becomes Dan, because it doesn't become Dan until the day of the judges, the days of the judges later on, where they end up taking that part of land and they make it and call it Dan. But God gives Moses all of this information and these facts, and he writes it down and puts it down, what God tells him to write, because Moses was also a prophet of the Lord, that he had all these things. And that is kind of deriving a little bit off topic, but it's relevant because I just wanted to explain here why they say pursued them on to Dan, when Dan was not yet actually there, but that's what they call it. And not even at this point, but in the future, that's what they call it, from when Moses wrote it. And that's just something that I wanted to share concerning this truth and this, because it's very fascinating that, the prophets, all the prophets, they are given information from God way before it happens. But that's stories for a different day, with different videos and different sermons for, future reference. And hopefully we'll get into some of those in the future. But that's the message for today, and you all have a blessed day.